right? These are all the things that you love about your river and make your river unique. Really, this is similar to sort of an affected environment or a kind of a state of the union right here. What are we dealing with when it comes to this situation that you have on your river right now? It really serves as the baseline from which to develop the rest of your things. This is an important step. They're all important steps. Describe conditions at the time of designation. That's really hard. Don't we wish we had information from 5 years ago? A lot of these rivers were designated in the 70s, the late 80s, the 90s, so you'll start to see that this is one of those things that might sound nice and easy, but establishing a set of existing conditions in the past, that's a challenge, as you can probably see. What you're going to want to do is include the kinds and amounts of visitor use, the facilities that are there, and how those relate to river values. So, well, if one of your values is recreation, you're going to describe, well, we got some non-motorized boating, we have some motorized boating, we have some bank fishing, we have these other uses. You're going to describe those to the best that you can in your existing situation. You're going to characterize those, and then here's that forward-thinking bit again. We want to identify likely trends for the future. As you can imagine, river use and river trends are pretty dynamic. So we're actually going to try to look out into the future a little bit through this whole process. These are typically 15, and more realistically, they're 20, 25-year, sometimes 30-year plans. You're going to want to anticipate what you're going to deal with during that time frame. And then a piece that starts on step one and carries through is the idea of measurable indicators. These, you're going to want to pick ones that are measurable and they're subject to change. So I hope that's obvious that you're not going to pick an indicator that's never going to change, although that would be really easy and probably more fun. Couple examples: number of user days that groups are required to camp within sight or sound of other campers. Camp encounters, we're probably all familiar with that in a river experience. Or amount of bare ground associated with high, medium, or low use campsites. Now, when it comes to picking indicators, if you're managing a river or you're a lot of use on a river, you're probably going to know your indicators. It's the stuff that people are talking to you about a lot. When you say, hey, I heard you had a nice trip last weekend, they go, yeah, but I saw like 4 too many people. It was just a little bit crowded. It's the stuff that's going to come up over and over again, those things that are measurable, subject to change, and are probably a problem, potentially. And we'll get to that here in the next couple steps. But picking these indicators in the first step is important because these are going to track through your entire process. So desired conditions. This is kind of the vision quest. What you're trying to define here is the minimum standard of those indicators you just picked and the protection that will ensure the protection of your river values, your free flow, your water quality, your ORVs. So you see you're narrowing in on a situation where you're trying to figure out indicators, and the next step is standards to quantify how much can we take. And of course it's based on different resource indicators, different social indicators, kind of like Randy pointed out in this room. Well, depending on what you're going for, whether it's a cocktail party or just making a lot of people uncomfortable, you're gonna pick different indicators. And an important component here, if you're not familiar with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it requires us to protect and enhance river values. Protect being the minimum, of course, that's our obligation, and then enhance. And so what really is going to be important moving forward when it comes to WSR planning is differentiating between these are our steps that are required for protection, and then these are our steps or other actions that are required for enhancement. And I think that's an interesting concept that, you hope people pick their words carefully back in 1968 when these acts get put together. Protect and enhance. I think that's a solid foundation for us to move through this. So step two, you're going to realize in that step one when you're gathering all that info, well, I kind of need it to be a little bit more site-specific. We have long rivers. Those rivers are much different. So what we can do now and throughout this process is define analysis areas. So analysis areas, kind of like our keynote speaker at the beginning of the conference, this is where we do the chopping up part. Let's just hope our chopping up makes more sense. So what you're doing when you're coming up, the identify need for action piece. So that comes up. So in step one, you've got your existing condition. Step two, you're hopefully agreeing with folks on what the desired condition is. And when you talk about desired condition from a recreational standpoint, I think there's an interesting term that they've used in the paper that really stuck out to me as a rec guy, which is what we're trying to do is define or capture the essence of a river experience. you know, the language and the wordsmithing in these things is pretty important. When we're writing about what ORV we're trying to protect, it's not sufficient to say, I like hanging out on rivers. It's very important to take the time to differentiate and to describe the experience that people are having out there. And I think we've come a long way from a recreation management and planning standpoint to be able to have the tools to do this a little bit better. So what kind of a setting do you want? Do you want a natural setting? Is it okay if there are power lines? Is it okay if there's a road next to it? You know, are you looking for are you looking to party on Lake Havasu, or are you looking to go down the Grand Canyon? So you can obviously, we know implicitly that there's a wide range, but what we need to do is define that essence and that experience that people are looking for. And when you look at, so step one was the existing, step two is conditions, you're gonna have a disconnect there. And there you go, there's your need for action. And Randy's gonna talk about how this applies to NEPA, but you know, you're gonna have a disconnect between those two things, and that's what we're gonna work on. So step three, so we're looking at, you know, at this point, numbers. We haven't gotten into numbers too much. Standards is where we really get into starting to deal with the numbers. So you have your indicators. That's camp encounters, that's bare ground. Standards is where we're starting to set those numbers that we feel can protect river values. Again, this is where we're distinguishing between protect and enhance. How many camp encounters is protecting? How many would be enhancing that experience? Again, standards are numbers, they're measurable. And what you need to do during this step is consider all the components of your system, the biological, physical, and social aspects of it. Standards could either be a resource condition that must be met, or cannot be exceeded, a percentage, for instance. There's a number of different ways to look at standards. So now we're on to step 4, and this is important to say, it's not just river use in general. We're talking about different types of uses. You need to drill down from a recreational standpoint on the kinds and types of use that could protect or enhance river values. This is a little bit where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of, you know, people maybe disagreeing a little bit about what sort of river experience it is that they're looking for. You know, is this something where a jet boat is appropriate? Well, it kind of depends on the values that you described at the beginning and the existing conditions and your desired conditions. So you're looking at those uses, and you know, you're looking at those that meet the standards that you just set. Not the place to have a long laundry list of things that are okay and not okay. We don't need to get into detail about, you know, the color of your boat. So we need to look at trying to put those categories of what meets or does not meet kind of our intent for protection and enhancement. We're going to take that use, and we're going to identify the actual amount of that use. So by the types we just laid out, we've got some non-motorized kayaking, we've got some motorized, we've got some drift boating over here, and what we're going to do is we're going to assign amounts of use. This is really kind of foreshadowing the maximum capacity that we're going to get to here soon, and you can do it, like we said, by analysis areas, by the chopping up method. You can use segments, you can use different sites, portions thereof. Obviously, lots of different ways to cut this up. I want to encourage you to look at how people are actually accessing it. So here's a little, just an example of how these things play out on the ground. You have multiple segments, you have multiple classifications, wild, recreational, which kind of correlates to the level of development that's on those river segments. And so what you want to do is in each of these segments, you're trying to quantify the amount of use by those types. And again, you're always tying it back to that overall objective of protecting the river values and then tracking through on your indicators and standards. So you really want to make sure when you get to this step, I mean, we're talking about X number of boats. So we're linking that use to locations and facilities. These things occur in reality. They occur in a spatial context. The more you can do to say this put in, that access point, it's going to go a long way. You know, you may have already done this in your earlier steps, but this is kind of pointing out you need to take this step of making sure that you're tying these things to locations on the ground. Sure. And Randy's clarifying these could be upland activities as well. So a wild scenic river corridor, you know, typically, you know, a setback on either side. There could be upland activities as well, and I'm kind of focusing on the river aspect because it's sort of easier to work through. So step 7, maximums. This is what the court asked the Park Service to do. It's not just throwing out numbers, it's throwing out what is the maximum number? What is the turning point where you are starting to violate those standards that you set? What's the turning point when your conditions are starting to go downhill? What is that maximum number? And this is Like I said, this is the crux. This is what we haven't wanted to do for a long time because it's hard. And we're going to have to do our best. An obvious point here, hopefully you're involving the public in a collaborative discussion, and I hope you're doing it before this step, because if you come out to the public at the moment that you have a maximum number, you might not have a great meeting, just a heads up. These are sensitive and often volatile issues. Thresholds. Thresholds, it's kind of similar to the limits of acceptable change. We're taking those standards and indicators. If your standard is a certain number of user campsites per mile or a certain number of camp encounters, what's a point before that threshold that you can actually reasonably take management action? So it might be before your standard is set or your standard is met or exceeded. It's a threshold, and there's hopefully going to be a buffer. Not in all cases. There's cases where it won't, but your management action, which we'll get to in the next step, is not going to be instantaneous. Hopefully you're realistic with your capabilities and you're setting yourself up to take action in the time that's reasonable. Occur before degradation, tied to standards. That's what we're talking about. It's kind of a too late type situation. So I'm running low on time, but I'll run through the last couple steps here. Actions, management actions. These are, we're all aware of different permitting systems, allocation systems, user education. The court decision is asking us to be very specific about which of these things would be triggered when our standards are exceeded or when your thresholds are exceeded. So it's not enough to say, here's a threshold, and we'll see when we get there. These are the actual things that you're going to do when that takes place. An important note, identify actions reasonably foreseeable for life of the plan. It's hard to think out in 15, 20 years, much less, it's hard to think out in hours. So this is, you're trying to identify actions that you can take in 10 years. Monitoring. Of course, it's very important to know if you've exceeded your standards based on your indicators by monitoring the situation. You're going to ensure that measures that you're taking are working prior to the degradation that's occurred. You're really tying all of your monitoring to those indicators and standards that you established away at the beginning of the process. So that is step 10. Hopefully that makes some sense, and I'm going to give it back to Randy to talk about how this ties into NEPA.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think you did a great job for coming in at the last minute to help with this. We've got a few slides and then we'll be done. Yep, we'll be good. So we want to reinforce that the 10 steps are not a linear function of just walk through these steps, but they're more of a thought process and the types of things that you need to include and have involved as you go through your user capacity analysis. And part of any sort of analysis is going to lead to a decision, and in a federal context, that means you're going to have to invoke NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act compliance, and come up with some sort of NEPA documentation. Well, as we think about these 10 steps, they naturally dovetail in with the NEPA process in a number of ways. We don't want to think of this as a linear process, and NEPA is not really a linear process, though it has some discrete steps. We think of it more as an iterative process of as you complete various portions of these steps, you're actually completing parts of the NEPA process, such as in step 1, where you're establishing those baselines, you're really coming up with your affected environment. Step 2, you're identifying your need for change. Steps 3 through 9 have all sorts of aspects that deal with the different alternatives that you're going to consider, the types of uses, what kind of uses, how many and where. They're going to play out in how you structure and define your alternatives as potentials for your area. Step 6 looks at those connected actions. Step 7 and 9 are really involved in the decisions, because that's where you're setting your thresholds, you're setting your final decision framework that you're going to use, and finally in step 10 you're doing your monitoring. So the bottom line for all of this is that, with wild and scenic rivers, they're going to need to establish and identify a user capacity. That's pretty clear cut from the judge or the circuit court judges. Even though it's a Ninth Circuit Court decision, other circuit courts are going to look at that and start to apply it nationwide. The CRMP should discuss the basis for those numbers, should have sound rationale, use the best available science, and we need to be proactive, use thresholds, use indicators that are responsive to the conditions that you have and the use types that you have, and then monitor those river values to ensure that we're meeting our protection and enhancement standard. And finally, identify a process where you can adjust those capacities over time if you see you're not meeting those standards. So the next steps for us as the Interagency Council is that, again, this paper that we've written, and we've just given you kind of a broad overview of the paper, is it's going through sort of a final review draft, and it's had one round of review. It's going through a second round of review after we send it out for comments. All of you will probably have a chance, if you're interested, to participate in a review comment as well. And then the technical paper, when it's finalized, will be placed on the rivers.gov website. And then we'll do some more training about that. I just want to mention that for any wild and scenic rivers need, you can find that on the rivers.gov website, as well as the river management website, where there's all sorts of information, useful information about wild and scenic rivers. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for sticking around today, and we'll stick around if you have any additional questions.
You are having your session tomorrow as well, so.
Yes, we have several sessions tomorrow to focus on specific aspects of managing a wild and scenic river based on the Act, and then on Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and specifically to the water resources projects determinations.
Okay, so last comments, last chance for the field trip. Sign up is tonight. Tomorrow, I will be hammering and cajoling and whatever else to get your evals. We really, really do want you to do the evals, so work on them tonight or in the morning, please, and start turning them in. Remember, we have continental breakfast in the morning, and we'll get started right on time. Oh, sure.
I'm wondering, do you feel that this new framework adequately addresses uncertainty? I'm thinking that with climate change and economic change, volatility and the pace of change is so increased. And so I get concerned that unless there's a lot of buffers or real orientation towards, taking precautions, that there's a tendency to make decisions based on, let's get as many people out there as we can because of the political pressures. And how can this framework help address that?
I think it's going to involve looking at the thresholds that you create, as those thresholds are going to be the things that are going to be responsive to your current conditions and those changing conditions. And because you're monitoring, hopefully you'll have a good feedback loop that will tell you if you have to make more rapid change because of changes in the environment, or can, you've got more time, that things are fairly static. So I think it's going to be, the thresholds are going to be very important.
All right, thank you very much. You can grab him after this. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. You did a great job.
Thanks, yeah. Oh, thank you. That's kind of unbelievable to put that topic at that time, right? When I got through the first deal, and I was like, I know that I was behind, but I'm just like, I thought flashing ahead, I'm like,
Yeah, still we're at the end. Yeah, still we're at the end, but that's okay.
Thank you.
You did great. You did great. Well, you'll get some more opportunities.